G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.31, Speculations, Part 2. In my final episodes, Steve Guerra of the History of the Papacy podcast and I are mulling alternative histories of earliest Christianity. We are working through a collection of divergence points from our timeline and wondering what might have happened. We presented our first two scenarios in part 1 of this series. This time, we look at 3 new and independent scenarios. First, what if Christian missionaries had never preached to the pagans? Second, what may have happened if Christian missionaries had ignored the Roman Empire and proselytised in Parthia instead? Third, what would have become of Christianity if the Jewish revolts had never occurred and the temple stood to the end of the empire? Hope you enjoy our musings. Okay, Steve, let's tackle the third scenario. Set when Paul was active. But let's say there is no Paul. There are no missionaries. There is no mission to the Gentiles. This comes back to what we were saying earlier. Basically, Christianity just remains a sect of Judaism. And I think, like all the other sects of Judaism, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the fourth philosophy, as Josephus calls it, the followers of Jesus would have ended up on the dustbin of history after the fall of the temple. And maybe one day some writings of theirs would be recovered from an Egyptian garbage dump, like the Gnostic writings were, and that's it. It'd be just a complete footnote to history.
This scenario is related to the last one in some ways. That I suppose it depends what happens with the Jesus clubs. Do they fold themselves back into the mainstream? Is there no mainstream of Judaism after? Because that's kind of a what-if scenario. Is after the destruction of the Second Temple, the non-Christian Second Temple Jews, they don't know what to do, and the Sadducees eventually fall away, and it's the proto-rabbinical Jews wind up being the winners, but there's nothing written in stone that is how things necessarily had to happen.
I mean, we do not know why the Sadducees and the Essenes, etc., disappeared. We have no idea why. The rabbis are certainly silent on the issue. So we don't know why these different groups that Josephus talks about actually disappeared. Traditionally, the rabbis are seen as evolving out of the Pharisees, but the rabbinical works themselves are fairly silent on the matter. They do talk about the Pharisees, but usually only to depict them as fairly fussy exponents of the law. And they talk about the Sadducees, who they don't like. The Sadducees are definitely our opponents. We don't really know what happened to the sects. And as far as I know, the rabbis never mentioned the Essenes, or they do mention the Boethusians, whoever the heck they were. I think it's fairly clear. If there had been no mission to the Gentiles, we would probably have never heard of Christianity.
Yeah, it's either the point of departure for that would probably have definitely been the first Jewish revolts and the destruction of the temple, and it would have been the toss-up is, do the Christians come out of it, the Jewish Christians, are they the mainstream that comes out of it, or is it some sort of proto-rabbinical Judaism? Is it the Sadducees? Who knows, really? And like you said, it's all a lot of conjecture. We say, the Essenes were the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, but they don't really know that for sure. They don't know who the Sadducees were exactly. They don't know who the the zealots were. It was just Josephus said these things, and the Gospels mention some of these things, and it's extrapolated that, oh, okay, that probably is the people who it's referring to, but it's definitely not set in stone.
Oh, absolutely. And I must admit, that's one thing which irritates me about many modern scholars in the Essenes. I mean, right from the beginning of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of scholars said, oh, we found them in areas which are close to places that Josephus said were occupied by the Essenes. Therefore, these are Essene material. And it was only about like 30 years after the Dead Sea Scrolls were dug up that people started saying, yeah, not sure about this Essene connection. Maybe someone just put them there, right? So that's my pet peeve of some scholars.
I did a lecture series by Rabbi Lawrence Schiffman, and
No.
from what I understand, he's one of the top Dead Sea Scroll scholars, and he talked a bit about that. And he never uses the Essenes. He calls them the Dead Sea sect.
Oh, okay.
Because there is no definitive connection.
Okay, so he's using Dead Sea sect simply to mean the people who put these documents here.
Yeah, because they were their own thing for sure. More extreme in a lot of ways.
I think the whole Essene connection was pushed very hard by the first scholars to look at them. Was it Father Roland de Vaux, just after they were discovered? And I think he and his team were keen to isolate the Dead Sea Scrolls as being simply the product of this eccentric sect, whereas nowadays it is tended to believe that they were quite widely used by all sorts of people. Let's move on to the fourth scenario. Okay, Steve, the fourth scenario. What if the Christian proselytizers had gone to the large Jewish populations in Babylonia, well, that's the old name, it was actually the Parthian Empire, rather than the Roman Empire? Peter could have gone to Babylon precisely because there were so many Jews in the Parthian Empire. In fact, I think it's estimated about 1/3 of all the world's Jews at that time were in the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire was pretty eclectic religiously, so Paul would have found it attractive, I think, because there were, lots of Gentiles, non-Jews, and Peter would have found it attractive precisely because there were so many Jews. But let's say that they go to there and they try and convert Parthians of various sorts. Do you think Christianity would have kicked off?
I think this is one, so far at least, this is one of the most interesting ones that you've proposed. And I wonder what you think of this. I don't think that Paul would have ever gone to the East because he was so Roman. Being Roman was as much of a part of his identity as he was more Jewish than, if I had to guess, how he perceived his own identity. But being Roman was huge part of his identity.
I hadn't thought of that. You're absolutely right. He was very proud of being a Roman citizen. Even more, not just a member of the empire, but a citizen. Yeah, he wouldn't have gone to Parthia.
So maybe there's a Parthian Paul who could go in that direction, which there could have been. It was a border region there.
We're fairly confident that there was a lot of Jewish communication between the Roman Empire Jews and the Parthian Jews. It was a little bit of an arduous journey, but the Mishnah itself mentions several famous rabbis who were born in Parthia and then moved to the empire. It may have been considered a long trip, but it was by no means rare. So, yeah, some Parthian guy could have come over. Now, okay, so let's say there is no Roman Paul. There's only proselytizing in Parthia. Would Christianity have kicked off at all, or would it, I don't know.
I think that it could have, because it really did seep into Parthia. It was just a much slower process. And you think about it, that story about the Magi, one of the theories about the Magi is that they were Zoroastrian magicians. That was a priestly class that had been bopping around Judea, Bethlehem, southern Levant for some reason. So that's an interesting story to throw in there.
Yes, it is. And it's just occurred to me, had the proselytizing been in Parthia, then these proto-Christians, or whatever you want to call them, would have avoided the 3 Roman Jewish wars completely. And the Parthians seem to have been quite religiously tolerant. They would not have been suppressed, but I wonder what would have happened when the Sassanids replaced the Parthians. The Sassanids were a lot less tolerant of plurality than the Parthians, and they strongly promoted Zoroastrianism.
Do you know approximately what date the Sassanids took over, or the Sassanids? I can't think of a date that they came to town.
I think it was around the time of the rise of Manichaeanism, around about 260.
There was a couple of interesting things that I thought about is, so you have the stories of the Apostle Thomas going east. Christianity, there's no reason that it couldn't, the way that it spread through the Roman Empire from city to city, there's really no reason it couldn't have happened. And it maybe was happening. I mean, I don't know that we have the sources necessarily from Persia that we do from the Roman Empire, at least things that are readily accessible in English as to people who don't speak Persian, or to see those sources. And who knows what kind of sources just didn't get copied after the Muslims took over Persia. And then you think about Tatian, who wrote the Diatessaron. That was in mid-2nd century, so that's another person who's taking the message in that direction. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is Armenia. And they were like I guess you could say they were somewhat of a hybrid Roman, Greek and Persian culture, but they converted full on to Christianity before even the Edict of Milan, I believe.
Did they?
I didn't write down the precise date. Early 300.
Well, that would show that Christianity was certainly appealing to people who were at least strongly influenced, if not halfway to being Parthians as opposed to Greco-Romans. I think that the scenario becomes complicated by the rise of Manichaeanism. So let's say that a strong Christian movement develops in Parthia and Armenia. Would it have maintained a separate identity when Mani appeared? Or would it have been absorbed into Manichaeanism?
Yeah, that's that's really hard to say, or to what degree. If a third of Christians decide to go to Mani, that could break the back of the movement.
We'll get to Manichaeanism in another scenario, another day. But Manichaeanism does seem to have been very attractive. And since it was such a syncretistic movement, it could probably have just swallowed up Christianity into its structure without even noticing it.
It worked well, too, with the Zoroastrian because it was so Gnostic and light and dark, where Christianity, at least mainstream Orthodox Christianity, really tried to veer away from Gnosticism, even though it had Gnostic tendencies. They really did do a lot to try and harmonize the spiritual and the material world, where Zoroastrianism was not into that and Manichaeanism wasn't into that.
Do you think that Christianity could have survived as an independent entity?
If Manichaeism had really taken off?
Yeah.
In the Roman Empire or in Persia?
Just let's say the Romans never hear of Christianity. It just doesn't go, but it takes off in Parthia.
I wonder if there would have been a big struggle, because what would the state have wanted to go to? And I think that that's so important back then. If the state wound up leaning towards one or the other, which they probably would have at some point, then I think that it would have crushed the one down to marginal status and raised the other one up to the full blooming of the religion, or the opposite would have happened.
I'd agree with that. I think It could have depended on whatever ruler decided, oh, I don't like that religion, let's get rid of it. But I'm rather keen on this one. They're my favourites. So let's make it the state religion in Parthia or whatever you want to call it. I tend to think that had Christianity evolved strictly in the Parthian Empire, it would have eventually been either crushed or absorbed into Manichaeanism, which was itself destroyed by the Sassanids in favour of Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, I think that all this one ties into a different possibility for a different day, but I think so much of it is that the state stepping in and picking the winner and the loser. It would have been interesting to see if the state in Parthia and Persia, and then when just that general area, depending on what dynasty is ruling, if they had either been schizophrenic on religion, oh, one day one ruler is really in favor of Christianity, and then a son takes over who is really in favor of Zoroastrian, and they start crushing the other one. Does it send them into a tailspin? If they can't, or do they decide to have some sort of proto freedom of conscience? And how does that affect their relations with the Romans? Does that weaken them, that the Romans see them as weak, and that causes more conflict between Persia and the West?
Yeah. Well, another open-ended conclusion.
No, I think we've done a great job of not having the big aha moment that people will expect. So if you go and read academic counterfactual history book and then you kind of get let down, oh, I guess it's a world of possibilities.
Okay, Steve, let's move on to scenario 5, where round about the early 60s, so Paul, say, and Peter are dead. What would have happened if the Jewish state had reached a concordat with Rome? There was no great revolt in 66, temple was never destroyed, and let's extend it and say that this concordat went on to the end of the Roman Empire, possibly. Now, Rome could have, for example, imposed a new native dynasty to rule, or perhaps the temple establishment could have established a complete little theocracy, semi-independent of Rome, and enforced a quiescent state. We know this was a distinct possibility because it had happened. The Herodians had ruled most of Judea for a century. It's just rather unfortunate that the sons, Herod Archelaus, he got the lion's share, and he proved to be the most incompetent of all of Herod's sons. And the Romans got rid of him after 10 years, and then installed a succession of really very mediocre Roman bureaucrats. And I suppose they were mediocre because, well, who the hell wants to be in charge of Judea? I'd really like to run Syria, big rich province to the north, or, even more juicy, Egypt to the south. Instead, I'm stuck here in this dust bowl. And the Romans basically, they just didn't seem to care. And Josephus pretty much tells us that all these bureaucrats were either just malignant or indifferent. So let's say the Romans never get around to taking over Judea. They put in a dynasty, and through some miracle of dynastic luck, the kings of this little area are actually pretty good. Okay, there's going to be the odd idiot every generation or two, but they keep a lid on things. So the temple is never destroyed. And I'm wondering what the effects of that would have been.
You get to the point that this is probably the most unlikely of situations, just because they were such a rowdy lot in Judea that just always causing problems, and they were all so factional. So even if you made one faction happy, that was likely to make the other faction really unhappy. But let's say that by some miracle they do clamp it down and make everybody happy. I think that it would really put a strain most likely on the Christian clubs, I would think, just because all the predictions was that the temple was going to get destroyed, apocalypticism, and it's hard to keep that apocalyptic fervor going when things are going pretty well.
I mean, the destruction of the temple would have appeared, I'm sure, to many Christians as like the pre-apocalypse, or oh my goodness, the world is actually about to end. Look at the disasters that have befallen us. But if that hadn't happened and everything just, well, you said that Jesus was coming soon and it's been, 300 years, nothing's happened. Temple's still there, temple establishment's still there. It seems to me that I think in the first instance, I cannot see rabbinic Judaism evolving. There was just no need for it. If the temple was still there and you've got all the priests and you've got everything, you don't need this really strange intellectual U-turn into making the Mishnah and the Talmud. And I think another thing that would have happened is that the Enochite apocalyptic literature would have survived and still been known to quite a lot of people. As we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, it would never have been suppressed. It would have been still a major current in one of the many factions, as you say, of Judaism. So I think maybe one possibility is that mainstream Judaism might have moved to become a bit more apocalyptic under the influence of this literature, and may have evolved to look a little bit like modern Christianity, maybe. On the other hand, the Christians might have moved to do whatever the opposite of whatever the intellectual elites of Judaism were doing. So if, for example, Jewish intellectuals began to embrace Enochite apocalypticism, maybe the Christians would have become more amenable to, say, Gnostic cosmologies. And maybe Christianity would have evolved into some polytheistic sort of religion.
I think that the synagogue system may have changed because they still would have needed those because for the most part, it would just be like Islam to this day. Most people, as far as I know, don't even make the Hajj. I mean, you're required to do it once in your life. So maybe a good chunk of the people do go to Jerusalem once in their life if they live in Rome or in Carthage or something. But the synagogue is still going to be their main center of worship and connection with the religion. Maybe the diaspora starts to go into a different direction of, what does this temple mean to me when everything that I need is right here? It's almost like a Protestantism where your local community is everything it all revolves around essentially your club. You have a loose confederation with the other clubs around you. It almost becomes a Christian in a way. Maybe a leadership forms and the temple becomes the Rome as in the papacy. They make some big pronouncements. It kind of trickles down into the synagogues, take it or leave it, but a lot looser than Christianity became.
That's a very interesting speculation. I hadn't thought about the role of the synagogues. So you still have the temple and the establishment sitting over in this distant land, and the synagogues, as you say, become more like a Protestant sort of thing and more important locally.
I wonder if it take the political element as well, that it's any which way you look at it, maybe a couple of revolts do pop up and they get slammed down really quickly. And it wouldn't take too many of those revolts to get smashed. I mean, eventually you see it that 3 or 4 revolts down the road, then there's not much revolting after that. That maybe it just happens earlier. A revolt or two gets smashed. There's not too bad of leadership amongst the Hasmoneans, and it takes out that entire political element from the religion, and it just becomes culture and religion and not politics as well.
So saying it removes, somehow the nationalistic element gets removed.
You're a Jew, but you live in Rome, and you're a Roman and a Jew, and they're two separate things. The Romans aren't coming in. I guess we could assume that the Romans still have it as a licit religion, so you can do your thing without sacrificing to the Roman gods. You can still be a citizen. So maybe that smooths out all of those conflicts as well.
Well, certainly the politics would have changed. I mean, if we have, say, a Herodian-like dynasty still running the place, yeah, you can definitely see revolts against them, because we know from the history of the Maccabees and Herod the Great, there were Jewish revolts against them. Ironically, in both those cases, they sent delegations to Rome, saying, can you please start running us? And when the Romans did, of course, end up running the place, then the Jews said, maybe that was a bad idea.
I've been doing a little research into Hanukkah, and you can see why the various revolts, the first Jewish revolt, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt and Kito's War, you can see why they kept trying to give it a chance to revolt against Rome because under the Maccabees it worked. I don't know if this analogy will cross over the Hail Mary pass in football where they throw it halfway, over halfway across the field, and sometimes that they catch it and they win the big game. Probably always had that in the back of their mind that, hey, we took out the Seleucids. Why not keep giving it a chance? Eventually, it got to the point that the revolts weren't working and things were pretty quiet for quite a long time in the general Levant area. That was a really interesting one. I think that was one of the trickiest one. I'm interested to hear what people think about that one.
Just to sum up, from my point of view, both Judaism and Christianity would have evolved in very different directions. No rabbinic Judaism, survival of apocalyptic movements, and quite possibly the whole Jewish Christian group. Maybe it would have stayed one of the little tiny sects or factions. The pagan clubs were up and running, and it seems fairly successfully. So there was a well-established Gentile version of Christianity. But let's say that the Peter James Club disappears totally. The Gentile Christians feel no connection to Judea. They regard Jesus, he just happens to have been Jewish. And that whole aspect goes.
It makes me think, I was thinking of this as the flight to Pella. That was during the first revolt, a bunch of the Jewish Christians, the Ebionites or whatever, the James Club essentially, left Jerusalem ahead of the actual destruction of Jerusalem and went to the city of Pella, which was in the Greek area. There was already a Jewish Christian group living in that city, Pella, which I don't know offhand how far. None of those places were that far, a couple of days' journey from Jerusalem. And the archaeology that they're doing now shows that they're very likely this did happen, even though it was reported by, I want to say, Eusebius of Caesarea, and then another person who I'm blanking on his name right now.
Eusebius is always a good guess.
Yeah, it was definitely Eusebius, and then another person with the Greek name with an E. They both recount pretty much the same story. But so these Jesus clubs had already started to spread out. And I wonder if, again, under that synagogue system, that they could have, we're a Jesus-leaning synagogue, and that's our thing. And the synagogue down the street is not a Jesus-leaning synagogue, and then the one might be that, Jesus is a prophet, but he's not the Messiah.
One synagogue has Jesus is our man. But you guys down the road, Enoch? No. Yes, it does sound very Protestant, doesn't it? Presbyterians versus Methodists and all that.
And nobody has a huge problem because you don't really have to interact with the others. Maybe the Sanhedrin comes down with a big pronouncement and you take it or leave it. That is definitely a head scratcher.
Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.